Hardtalk today is in central London. My guest is New Zealand's visiting Prime Minister John Key. His first time in office has been a baptism of fire. He's had to cope with a prolonged economic slowdown and a string of disasters, including a major mining accident and the devastating Christchurch earthquake. Geographically isolated and small in population, just how resilient is New Zealand when put to the test? Prime Minister John Key, welcome to Hardtalk.
Thanks very much, great to be here.
Is it proving harder than you expected to be New Zealand's Prime Minister?
Well, we've certainly had more challenges than one might either want or expect. If you think about the time that I've been in office, nearly 3 years, we've had the global financial crisis, 2 earthquakes in Christchurch, Pike River mine disaster. We've ended up having to buy and bail out a number of finance companies, and in recent times provide support for an insurance company which has a large exposure to Christchurch. So it hasn't been an easy time for us.
Those are massive tests, and we'll go through them in some detail, but they're tests that you've had to face as, I think, the most inexperienced Prime Minister in the last 100 years of New Zealand's history. I mean, you came into office, I think, just 6 years as an MP, 2 years as party leader. You weren't really terribly well equipped as a political leader, were you?
Well, it depends on what you think are the skills that you need to be a good Prime Minister. I mean, it's certainly true I got there in the fastest time. Prior to me was David Long, who I think took 7 years. But I think in modern day politics you are seeing the emergence of young leaders. We're seeing that in the case of President Obama now in the US, obviously with David Cameron here in the United Kingdom. And I think the experience that I had working in a number of international markets here in the UK, Singapore and Australia and the likes, that banking experience where you have very much the economy at front and centre stage of the issues New Zealand faces, I think actually the mixture of skills I've had have been about the right ones.
Well, you were a successful banker, you made lots of money, but you'd never, for example, run a city, let alone a ministerial department. And then to go to some of those challenges you've already alluded to, here you are faced, for example, in Christchurch with what you, I think, described as possibly, maybe, New Zealand's darkest day ever with the Christchurch earthquake.
But I think the answer to that is that you need to have a plan. I mean, ultimately, one of the things the commercial sector teaches you is that you have to have a sense of where you're going, a sense of how you're going to achieve that, and to be able to frame up the challenges that you face. In the case of Christchurch, if one puts to one side the human tragedy, which has been enormous, when we lost 181 people there, then the process of funding the rebuilding, of what is actually required to make that happen and allow that to happen in a time frame which is sensible both for New Zealand and for the people of Christchurch, I think is rather self-explanatory. Now, we have taken some hard calls. We've passed legislation which gives us very wide and encompassing powers to enable us to rebuild Christchurch quickly. We've essentially assumed that responsibility at a central government level.
Does it make sense to rebuild Christchurch quickly? I mean, the city's still getting serious tremors. It's had, around the area of the city, it's had 2 major earthquakes in the last 8 or so months.
Yes.
Is it wise to rebuild Christchurch?
We believe so. The second earthquake we think is an aftershock of the first one, and that's been supported by our scientists in New Zealand. Now, it's true, there's been 5,000 aftershocks in Christchurch, measuring above, I think, 3 or 4 on the Richter scale since the first earthquake on the 4th of September.
And because of that, you have a lot of people in Christchurch who are saying, I want out of the city. I see no future for myself and my children in this place.
It's been interesting, actually, the response. I mean, look, there are about 400,000 people that live in Christchurch, and there is no perfect way of measuring how many people have or will leave. But if you put your finger in the air and say, what's that number likely to look like? I guess it's 20 to 30,000 people.
You're sounding determinedly upbeat, but here's where it gets very difficult for a very small country. The population is not much more than 4 million. We're talking about your second city. Economists reckon that in the short run, the next year or two, it could mean that rather than expecting growth of over 3%, it might be down to 2%. So it's a real drag on New Zealand's economic prospects. And that's, in a way, illustrating how vulnerable your small country is. Would you accept that?
Well, by definition, any small country where it's affected by a very large event has less room to move than, say, a larger country. That's a statement of fact. Having said that, New Zealand finds itself in economically quite a strong position. So gross debt to GDP is under 20% currently, and we are going into our budget process on May the 19th with a zero budget. So instead of spending $1 billion more, we'll spend zero, and that money will be used over time to pay for the earthquake. So we are addressing that through essentially trimming government expenditure.
But what you do not have in New Zealand right now is strong growth. In fact, you have virtually no growth at all, and that's really not something you can blame on the earthquake. I just wonder whether you, with all of your financial background, overestimated your ability and the country's ability to deliver sustainable growth, because it isn't happening, is it?
Well, we wouldn't accept that proposition. I mean, for a start off, the global financial crisis had quite an impact. So when we came into office at the end of 2008, the country had experienced 3 quarters of negative growth, and that continued into the back end of 2008 and early 2009. But if you strip the earthquake out and say, okay, how does New Zealand really look? We have a very strong commodity sector. So it's not just dairy prices. Forestry, lamb, beef, seafood, all of those are at record highs. And notwithstanding that we're combating a very high exchange rate, actually that part of our economy is very strong. We have the Rugby World Cup in New Zealand. The Christchurch rebuild will add probably 1% to GDP every year for the next 5 to 7 years. So look, the picture that we see is one of growth above 4%.
You're painting a rosy picture, which I think a lot of New Zealanders might question. I mean, they heard you, for example, in the last couple of years, consistently saying, we are going to close the prosperity gap, the wages gap in particular, with Australia, and people compare yourselves with Australia. It hasn't happened. In fact, the wages gap is wider than ever.
Actually, we also reject that proposition, but let me take you through that.
The opposition leader, just the other day, Phil Goff, he said the best this government can do is now trumpet that New Zealand wages are 30% below Australia's, giving us a supposed competitive advantage. He used to talk about the fact we were going to close the gap.
I won't get into a political debate about the robustness of his numbers, but let me take this step back for you. New Zealand has had a widening wage gap with Australia over the course of the last 40 years. Primarily mineral resource base in Australia. So Australia's very minerally wealthy, and China's having a huge impact on their market. So to give you some idea of that, the capital investment going into the mining sector in Australia for the last decade has averaged about $5 to $10 billion a year. In the last 3 years alone in Australia, it's been $55 billion a year.
I'm sure you don't want to spend the whole interview comparing yourselves with Australia, but here is one important fact. More than a quarter of New Zealand's graduates, that is the brightest and the best that your country's producing, are now living outside of your own country. That's 10 times the rate for Australian-born graduates, and that suggests to me that you have got a structural problem.
Well, we agree with that point, and that's why we have the aspiration of closing that wage gap, and it's one of the reasons why we've gone to making the changes that we have to try and encourage those high earners to stay in New Zealand. Now, if you go to the position we inherited before we became the government, unless you earned over $220,000 in New Zealand, you paid more tax in New Zealand than Australia. Because of the tax changes we've made, that's now $50,000.
So, Prime Minister, you're delving deep into the details. So, to me, it seems like a much more obvious and simple proposition. In the end, New Zealand is a very small country with a very small population, and a lot of New Zealanders, young, bright New Zealanders, seem to feel that they can get on in the world very much better if they leave the country. It's not just about tax rates, it's just about the potential. Your country is too small to offer bright young people what they really want.
Well, again, we'd reject that proposition. So let's have a look at the population growth.
Well, you might reject it, but they aren't rejecting it because they're voting with their feet.
Actually, that's not strictly correct. So if you go back to about 1990, New Zealand's population was 3 million. Today it's 4.5 million.
You could ensure that you get a faster, a greater influx of new immigrants, but it seems even that isn't happening in your country.
Well, that's not true. I mean, if you go and have a look at it, no country in the OECD of a population base that we've had has had as bigger increase in its population than New Zealand.
Do you want, I mean, are you telling me right now, you as Prime Minister of New Zealand want to see a whole new wave of immigration into your country?
Well, what I'm telling you is we're pro-immigration. The issue for New Zealand is whether people can bring skills or bring capital, and ultimately bring the right attitude towards building a strong, vibrant, outward-looking and successful New Zealand. And actually, the evidence shows we've been very successful in that. I mean, if you just take the UK as an example, a lot is made of New Zealanders coming to live in Britain and enjoying the big OE and working in some of the big commercial firms, like I did when I was in my banking career.
You spent many years working
Absolutely.
in London, making a lot of money.
Absolutely.
And I wonder if you're the right person to be telling New Zealanders, you know what, you should stay at home, invest in your own country, and you can make it in your own country because you had to come here to make it.
Well, but let's look at those numbers. I mean, 4,000 New Zealanders a year come and live in Britain. 18,000 British people come and live in New Zealand each year. So actually, when it comes to attracting talent, whether it's teachers or nurses or doctors, New Zealand's been highly successful in attracting those.
You just dodged one very basic question, though. I mentioned Kevin Rudd, his vision of an Australia of 36 million people. What is John Key's vision of what New Zealand's optimum population ought to be?
Well, I don't have an optimum population target because I don't think that's the right way of looking at it. What I'm interested in is people that can make a contribution to New Zealand. Now, where they come with skills and where they come with capital, we're interested.
Some New Zealanders are already worrying that one of the country's unique selling points, that is, and your advertising slogan, I think, was all about this, about the 100% pure New Zealand, the idea that you're a greener nation than any other in the developed world. That already isn't true as your population does slowly rise, and it's going to get worse. Dr. Mike Joy of Massey University, a leading environmental scientist in your country, he said just the other day, he said, we are delusional about how clean and green we are.
Well, that might be Mike Joy's view, but I don't share that view.
But he is very well qualified, isn't he? And
Well,
he's looked, for example, at the number of species threatened with extinction in New Zealand. He's looked at the fact that half your lakes, 90% of your lowland rivers are now classed as polluted.
Well, look, I'd hate to get into a flaming row with one of our academics, but he's offering his view. I think any person that goes down to New
He's
Zealand...
a scientist. It's based on research. It's not just an opinion
He's
plucked
one
from the air.
academic, and like lawyers, I could provide you another one that will give you a counter view. If anybody goes down to New Zealand and looks at our environmental credentials and looks at New Zealand, then for the most part, I think, in comparison with the rest of the world, we are 100% pure. In other words, our air quality is very high.
100%. 100% is 100%, and clearly you're not 100%. I mean, you know, whether you agree with Mike Joy's figures or not, you've clearly got problems of river pollution. You've clearly got problems with species which are declining,